So Sicario was great, as to be expected. Now this movie was directed by Denis Villeneuve, who has directed pretty great movies throughout his entire career. Now admittedly, I've not seen every single Denis Villeneuve movie, but from the movies that I have seen, I've always been very impressed with his style and direction. And that is one of the two aspects that I really love about this movie, is his directing. The way that this film is directed does a really great job with its pacing, which is the second reason why I love it so much. The combination of these two make it seem very stressful and intense and do a great job of building tension throughout the entire film. The slow-paced nature of the film does a really great job with letting you sit and think about the concepts and themes and ideas of this film. This movie may not be the most complex thing in the world, but it certainly leaves you with a lot to think about after the film ends. All the performances were done very well. The way that information is revealed throughout certain scenes really fits in with the slow-paced nature of the film. It certainly makes it feel much more impactful for the viewer and the characters going through it. Now, while the acting is very well done, fits for this movie, my favorite performance would have to be from Josh Roland. He does a pretty great job portraying his character, and I think he was the best actor in the movie. Now, the pacing in this film might seem a little slow at first with a lot of other Denis Villeneuve's movies, but it really does do a great job of paying off with the build-up and tension throughout the film. There are action scenes throughout this film that are so incredibly well done. They're not even that long or that complex, but they really do a great job of putting you into the center of the tension throughout the film. The visual style of this movie is also very well done. It's not overly done with its directing and cinematography, but it really does manage to have its own sense of style. There's a lot of variety of ways they film certain scenes to make it truly engaging. Another thing that I really want to talk about this movie is its unique way in presenting the story and characters. Now, I don't want to spoil too much of this movie, and if you've seen the movie you would definitely have an idea of what I'm talking about, but the way that this movie decides to present its certain perspective through characters are certainly very interesting. If this movie were presented in a different way, it would be kind of more cliche, but the way that it's presented really makes you feel much more interested and engaged in these characters as information is slowly revealed throughout the film, but particularly near the end of the movie. And the characters are also very well defined and relatable, and the movie does do a great job of making it feel like a real journey as we learn information through the main character's perspective. Now, overall, I really do enjoy this movie, and I'd recommend it to just pretty much everyone. And definitely watch some other Denis Villeneuve movies if you haven't already. And this one gets a very strong 8 out of 10. I also managed to get around to seeing The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers. Now, Robert Eggers directed Nosferatu and The Lighthouse, two movies I haven't seen, but I'm very excited to do so. And from my understanding, this is considered one of his weaker films. That doesn't mean people hate it, but they just consider it pales in comparison to The Lighthouse. Now, this is my first Robert Eggers movie, and I personally found this a great way to introduce myself to this director. First off, everything was incredibly well shot. There was clearly a lot of thought into how the movie would look, and certainly with a lot of symbolic elements and scenes that went on, this movie definitely has a lot of style to it and thought put into how it would show those elements. On a pure technical element, this movie is absolutely phenomenal with some great costume design and set design just in general, as well as locations. It truly makes the movie feel alive, and this movie certainly seems very well researched for the time period that it takes place in. I remember that the music was well utilized in the scenes that it was, and the score itself was actually pretty well memorable from my experience. I remember that the music was being well utilized for the scenes that it was incorporated into, and the music was also well done from what I remember. Another aspect that I want to talk about this film would be the story and story structure in and of itself. Now, this story obviously takes a lot of inspiration from Hamlet, and it does play pretty closely to the original source material from my understanding, but at a certain point it begins to subvert expectations and goes off to tell its own story or make a certain twist on the very compelling narrative, and I felt that it worked very well for this story and what the movie was going for. It's very out there, very weird, kind of shocking, but I think it works well for what the film is aiming to be. The action and fight scenes in this movie are so well choreographed and done. There's a certain brutality and visceralness brought to the film. Now, overall, I really did enjoy this movie, and I plan on watching it again at some point, so this one gets a very strong 7 out of 10. So, Pixar's Elemental was not very good, which is surprisingly much better than I was originally expecting it to be. Now, originally I was not really interested in watching this movie at all when it first came out, mainly because all of the promotional material that I saw coming from this movie just seemed very generic and derivative from other Pixar movies. Mainly Zootopia comes to mind, not to mention the entire story and gimmick and theme throughout the entire film is something that's been done many times before throughout other Pixar movies, and apparently a lot of people felt the same way that I did, because this movie had the lowest opening since the original Toy Story, which in turn led to a very weird marketing trick on part of Disney and Pixar. They posted to their official Instagram page a fake movie audience reaction, in which they were trying to promote the character Claude, who has no affiliation with other Pixar movies or projects. This character only shows up in the movie a few times to just deliver bad puns, so it's just very weird that they were trying to rely on this character as their saving grace for their movie. And then the reviews were rather harsh on it, more than I was expecting it to be, so this really just piqued my interest in seeing it. So I got around to watching it, and yeah, it's not very good. Now first off, like I said, the entire gimmick to this movie just felt very derivative from other Pixar movies, mainly a reference to the entire gimmick and presentation and world that this movie takes place in. It definitely feels like something you've seen thousands of times before, not only in other Pixar movies, but just in media in general. Now this movie did remind me a lot of Zootopia, mainly because they share the same basic theme and idea and structure to the story, and also the actual gimmick to the movie of basically this being a city with different beings in it. But in Zootopia, I feel like they put so much more thought into its universe. In Zootopia, there were basically different transport ways and methods that different animals could use to avoid accident. In Elemental, it just seems like they're all squished together and it's not really thought out well or fleshed out. And don't get me wrong, if they put that aspect into the movie, it wouldn't fix the movie and make it a good movie all of a sudden, but it does show where the creative thinking went and how it was willing to think out its universe and how much effort they were willing to put into the film. Now something that is a much larger criticism is the fake out death near the end of the film. So basically what happens is that the fire girl and water boy are trapped in a building together and it's getting really hot and he's evaporating. They never established that this is how he could die earlier in the movie. It doesn't really matter, I guess, but whatever. And he starts evaporating and he's gonna die and eventually he dies and the girl gets free. But what happens is that she says something so sad that the water starts seeping out of the ceiling and he basically cries himself back to life, like he evaporated into the ceiling and now he just got really sad and basically cries himself back into existence. And this whole scene, the whole fake out death, is just so incredibly predictable and stupid. This movie just hits a lot of tropes and unnecessary gimmicks throughout the entire movie, and it's just very annoying throughout, to be honest. And the derivative nature of this movie would be a lot more forgivable if it at least had a decent story and satisfying narrative, but so many aspects in this movie are just so incredibly poorly done. Even many aspects that a lot of people will be undeniably praising Pixar for, such as the animation and music, are just so poorly done in this movie. The character designs in particular are some of the worst character designs that Pixar has ever come up with. They're just so terribly done, especially on the fire people. In all honesty, it just looks very cheap and unprofessionally done, which is not what I've come to expect from Pixar. Also, the music in this movie was very unconvincing and just did not feel like it fit there at all. There's a small montage scene in the middle of this movie, and the music that they decide to add to the scene is just so poorly done and such a terrible song, and it does not fit with the movie at all. There's a bit of a montage scene in the middle of this movie, and the song that they choose to use in this scene is just so poorly done. Not only do I dislike the song, but the entire way that it's used in this scene just does not feel justified. Now, this movie's problems obviously go far and beyond the technical aspects such as the animation and music. This movie is just so incredibly poorly written and derivative at the same time. The entire main premise of this movie of being basically an allegory for immigration and prejudice is just so poorly derived from other movies. The romance writing in this movie is just so incredibly unconvincing. The two leads do not have any chemistry with each other whatsoever. The voice acting for most characters is either below average or just terrible, such as the dad character. Also, this movie was also very weirdly structured, with the main conflict being resolved much earlier in the movie and then being brought back later just at a random point. It felt very inorganic in my opinion. The comedy writing in this movie is just so incredibly terrible and cringeworthy. There are so many attempts at jokes that just fall completely flat. It's some of the worst comedy writing that Pixar's ever come up with, to be honest. Not to mention this movie can't help itself with making every single pun that it ever can. It just gets super annoying after the second or third time, but they keep doing it throughout the entire movie. And something that really annoyed me personally throughout the film is that during the second to third act low point in the film where they have the two main characters break up, it's a common trope in many movies, especially Pixar movies, and Pixar does not exactly have the best track record with this, as finding really dumb reasons for them to break up between the second and third acts. But in this movie, it's just so incredibly terribly done. Now, for a bit of context, earlier in the movie, the fire girl said that she always wanted to see this rare flower, but now it's flooded where she can't see it anymore. So later in the movie, the water boy brings her to this area and they're able to bring it down and see it. And after they get out of this museum area that's been flooded, they hug and the guy says, "I'm so lucky to have you," and it reminds her of her dad that she promised to take over the family store for. And after this moment, right where the guy shows her the Vivisteria plant that she wants to see her whole life, she decides to break up with him. It's just so incredibly forced and unnecessary, to be perfectly honest. It was just so terrible and it was obviously something they had to check off the list. And in all honesty, my experience watching this movie at the hour point, I just wanted it to be over. This is definitely one of the weaker Pixar movies I've seen in recent years, and maybe of all time, to be perfectly honest. It really just goes to show where the studio is at and creatively bankrupt they are right now. And in all honesty, there are several scenes where this movie just feels like it's kind of wasting time in all honesty. The pacing of this film doesn't really work all that well for me personally. Now obviously going into this movie I did not expect to like this movie and I expected to kind of hate it. I don't hate it as much as I originally thought I would, but I certainly don't enjoy it at all and I'll forget about this movie within a week. So right now this movie gets a 3 out of 10. And finally I also got around to watching The French Connection, and unfortunately I found it to be somewhat disappointing. Now although I didn't love this movie as much as I wanted to love it, I still found aspects to appreciate about it, so I'll talk about those before I get into my issues with this movie. For one, I really enjoyed the visual style of this movie. It's very gritty, very realistic. It does a really great job of establishing the tone and environment of this movie. Another aspect that does come to mind would be the car chase sequence throughout this film. I found it to be well directed and well presented for the most part, and it was definitely engaging to watch. But unfortunately that was just a sequence in an otherwise kind of boring movie to me. In all honesty, this movie felt very cliched at certain points when it came to its characters, and the plot just seemed so slow paced, and I just kept wondering, why does any of this matter and why aren't they getting to the meat of the film? Now as I said earlier, the characters in this movie were just kind of forgettable and cliched to me, and in all honesty I'd be very surprised if I remembered this movie within a week at all. At certain points this movie made me wish I was watching Good Time. In all honesty, I don't really feel as if I have that much to say about this movie. It was kind of forgettable, slow paced, didn't really feel all that justified in its slow paced and kind of uninvesting throughout. I only saw this movie a day ago, but already I'm just beginning to forget about it. So this one gets a more generous 5 out of 10.